Morning, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 or session 3. So, building on from the previous two videos that I've done on innate behaviour and learned behaviour, I wanted to go back to instinctive behaviour, which I referenced when we were talking about innate behaviours. So, as I've said, it's an innate form of behaviour. It's very species specific and it's something that is genetically predispositioned. So it's within you, it's something that organisms, animals, will carry out without any kind of learning required behind it. It's more complex though because it's influenced by quite a few factors. So what I want to start off talking about are biological rhythms. So biological rhythms are natural fluctuations that happen, and they can happen within an animal and they can also happen within the environment around them. So starting off talking about within, that would be your so internally, endogenous rhythms. And they tend to be the natural fluctuations and cycles and changes in things like hormone levels and nerve impulses. Then you've got exogenous. And the exogenous rhythms are things like the changes to the seasons, the lunar months, the daylight, the temperature. And the important thing about those is that they can directly impact upon your internal endogenous rhythms. And what that can mean is that these interplay quite nicely and can very drastically affect the physiology of animals because they act as stimuli and therefore affect their behaviour. Now, if I were to give you just a quick example so that you can have something more tangible that you can relate the endogenous and the exogenous to, it's probably going to be something like the circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms are your natural cycle of sleep and wake, or sleepiness and wakefulness. Now, internally, we have fluctuations in hormone levels, things like melatonin, that control our wakefulness. And if you were to take a human volunteer participants and put them in an environment that was devoid of daylight and nighttime, so sunrises and sunsets, you would find that internally we have our own predetermined 24-hour cycle of sleep and wake. Now, what most of us experience is, according to where we live, we sync up to our environment. So that internal sleep-wake cycle syncs up to the daylight and the nighttime of where we are living. And it's probably most noticeable to us all if you've ever crossed a time zone and you've experienced jet lag. So jet lag is when you become out of sync. So your internal rhythm and the external rhythm are completely out of whack, and that leads to you feeling sleepy when it's daytime and wide awake in the middle of the night. But everybody gets over it in the end. Your internal rhythm is able to resync itself, and usually within about a day or two you have re-established and you have reset everything. It's also these fluctuations in hormones that are caused by the environment is what leads to things like SAD, or seasonal affective disorder, which a lot of people in the UK like to talk about when it gets wintry. They're like, oh, I feel really down, really miserable because the days are so short. But we know that in places like Alaska, where they essentially get plunged into darkness for horribly long periods of time, that actually can be a really significant problem that they face because it does change your hormone levels. So that's a really good one to just sort of get your head around the idea of biological rhythms. Now, as I said, they are very, very potent stimuli for animal behaviour. So in particular, we're going to talk about territory and courtship behaviour. So territory. Territory is very important. It's important to all organisms because it's an area that is usually in possession of either one or multiple resources, and that could be food and water, it could be shelter, nesting sites, it could be mates. So territories are usually established and maintained by male members of the species, and they need to be able to do that successfully. And that will be dependent upon things like their genetic health, and it also is dependent upon hormones, for example. So we know that testosterone is a hormone that when it is in high levels in an animal, it can make them far more aggressive. And in terms of establishing or taking over or maintaining a territory, that's a good thing. You need to be sort of ramped up and ready for either a fight or particularly good at doing a certain display. So yeah, if we inject certain animals with extra testosterone, we usually find that they are far, far better with their territory maintaining and establishing. Now, territories themselves can be huge. They can be, hundreds of meters squared, or they can be quite tiny. It doesn't really matter. It's more to do with the animal and what resources it has. In terms of defending a territory, it can be physical aggression. You can get actual fights happening. You can get rutting between deer. You can get boxing between hares. If you've ever seen elephant seals having a proper ding dong, that's pretty scary. But it can also be displays, it can be calls, it can also be scent related, and we'll talk a little bit more about scent later, but it can be that some animals, in particular carnivorous, so the meat eaters, are able to produce certain scents through scent glands that are usually excreted through their urine to mark boundaries of their territory. And it can also be the case that other members of that species can gauge how much of a threat the one who has done the scenting is by the strength of the smell. So it can be quite handy on that front. You can have a particular scent that really tells people to back off and leave you be. Now, territory, as I say, because it's so closely linked to or so necessary for things like food resources and nesting sites, it's very, very important when it comes to initiating courtship for many animals. Now, what you have to think about when you're thinking about courtship is nearly all examples that you can think of, it's the males trying to impress the females, and it's the females that are picky, and there is a good biological reason for that. So this is what we're talking about when we mean sexual selection. I said that sentence awfully. So sexual selection, if you've heard of it before, wonderful. If you haven't, I'll try and just give you a quick overview. We're all very familiar with the idea of survival of the fittest in natural selection, which is the idea that you are better adapted and you survive. And therefore, because you've survived, you reach reproductive age, you reproduce, and you pass on those advantageous alleles to the next generation. But it is not the case that just because you survived, somebody wants to mate with you. So not only have you got to survive to reproductive age, but you've got to be selected by a mate for sexual purposes. So there's like a second layer of selection in there. And things like being able to establish and maintain a territory is part of sexual selection. Many females will not want to mate with an individual that does not have a territory. And there, as I say, is a good reason for that. Now, if you think about females, female gametes, things like eggs, are usually far, far rarer. They are produced in lower numbers and they are produced far less frequently than male gametes. So, for example, if you're a female, you may release an egg every month for your period where you are reproductively capable, so from puberty until menopause. Whereas if you are a male, you can produce millions of sperm, many of them from puberty for the rest of your days. So if we're talking about sort of rarity and therefore biological value, eggs are very valuable. Female gametes are very, very valuable. Second layer to it is if you are a female and you are going to give up one of your very, very valuable eggs to be fertilized, that hopefully means that you are going to end up pregnant, or at least nurturing an egg, for example. That's going to require an awful lot of resources and an awful lot of energy, which is biologically very demanding. And obviously, you don't want to enter into that process and that commitment and that sacrifice of resources if your partner is not going to be genetically fit and strong. You need the best specimen you can find, and it's usually judgment of whether an individual or male is genetically strong is down to things like physical characteristics and behaviours, and also territory maintenance, to be honest, because you want to have an offspring that is fit and healthy and is going to survive and thrive, because the whole point of most animals' existence, well, the whole point of all our existence, to be perfectly frank, is to successfully reproduce and to keep the line going. So you want strong and healthy. Second of all, once you've actually had your offspring, You want a partner that is going to be able to provide for and protect you. And that can be, again, territory, food resources, nesting sites, shelter. But also you need an individual that can protect you, maybe from predators, often from members of your own species. So a case in point would be lions and lion prides. A lion pride essentially has one male who is the leader of the pack, and then the rest are all lionesses and they're young. That one male mates with all of the lionesses, all of the offspring belong to him. If that male is toppled by another competing male, if there is a new pack leader that comes in and takes over the pride, obviously the lionesses stay where they are, but any cubs that already existed that belonged to the previous pack leader, the new leader will kill them all. It's called infanticide, and it's because they're not his. He doesn't want to waste his resources or his pride's resources raising cubs that are not genetically his, because what's the point of that? So if you are a lioness in that situation and that happens to you, if the guy you've decided to have a baby with gets toppled and he's gone, and then the new guy comes in and kills your baby, what a waste of resources, what a waste of your time. And I don't mean emotionally, but biologically, that's not something you want to happen. So females have got to pick based on all of those criteria: strong, healthy, genetically, physically, able to protect, provide and maintain. So on as I say, on a biological front, it can seem quite mercenary, but it's up to the males to show that they are worth the gamble. They're worth you giving up a prolonged period of your life and your resources and your eggs. So courtship then. Courtship's a beautiful word. The idea of courting is lovely. So it's the idea of romantic, of setting up a relationship to enable or facilitate reproduction. So there are a number of things that tend to happen or tend to be stimulated in animals when they start going through courtship behaviour. So as I say, these are very, very species specific. So number one, it can be things like elevated hormone levels. So we know that in humans, in females, when you are ovulating, which is when you are releasing an egg, you get an elevation. You get that spike in things like estrogen. So it can be raising levels of hormones. It can be maturation, so maturing of your gonads, which are where your gametes are produced, sperm and eggs. It can be that an organism changes colour to really signal to other members of its species that it's ready to rumble. A lot of this is about telling others that you are ready to reproduce, that the time is now. So colour changes, it can be that parts of the body get larger. It can be with birds that their feathers, their plumage gets larger and more colourful. It can be that they start making auditory cues, so usually mating calls, to again advertise the fact that they are ready. It can be postural displays, so it can be that things like birds start doing certain dances and holding themselves in a certain way. And it can also be scent related, so it can be a smell. So it might be that some animals release pheromones. So pheromones are these very, very potent chemical sexual attractants. So they act as, they're usually released, often released by females, but actually can be released by both genders. And they stimulate the other gender of the same species, obviously, to change their behaviour or physiological changes that get them ready for reproduction, all the things that are supposed to help reproduction happen. So we know civet cats, musk deer, mares, which are female horses, cows, which are female cattle, as opposed to bulls, silk moths, and they can have their pheromones work over huge distances. So the females release them and the males are able to detect them with their little antenna at huge distances, and which causes them to head towards the female, head towards the source of the pheromone. Now, interesting about humans and pheromones, it used to be that we thought that humans didn't really do any of this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Although there haven't been any true pheromones identified, there are definitely scents that are released, so smells that are released by humans that seem to have an impact upon attractiveness or behaviour. So I'll give you an example of one. So there's an androsterone that's released by human males, adult males. And it seems that when women smell it, they find it more attractive when they're ovulating. So what that means is that smell is more appealing when a woman is at her most fertile. So obviously if the smell is more appealing, you would assume that meant that the male was more appealing. So if a female is more attracted to a male when she is fertile, that increases the likelihood of them having sex. And obviously if she's fertile, that massively increases the likelihood of her successfully becoming pregnant, which is the whole point of the game. We also know that studies have shown that females change their preference for who they find attractive at different points during their cycle. So there's a fascinating piece of research. And again, I will try and find videos that relate to all of these for you to have a little look at. But they found that for most of the cycle, when you are not fertile, we quite like men who are not stereotypically masculine looking, so have slightly softer features. The idea is that they are maybe have lower testosterone levels and they are more likely to be caring and nurturing. Yet when we are at our most fertile, we are attracted to more typically masculine looking males with higher levels of testosterone, because we've got a different drive. We're looking for somebody to genetically father our babies. So there's been quite a lot of studies that have shown that if a woman is going to be unfaithful, this is awful, isn't it? If a woman is going to be unfaithful and cheat, she's most likely to do that when she is ovulating, so when she's at her most fertile, which means the moment that she is maybe unfaithful, she is most likely to get pregnant, which isn't great. But again, Professor Robert Winston's done a whole study into that. Another one that Professor Robert Winston has talked about in a number of his documentaries is related to smell. And it's the idea that we think that female humans are able to, through smell, judge whether a male has a very different immune system to her or a very similar immune system to her. Now, what we are looking for as females is an individual with a different immune system to ourselves. If you go for somebody who's similar, that means your baby basically has an immune system that is the same as both its parents. So if you're both the same, it's because I've got this much immunity. Whereas if you are very different in terms of your immune systems, your baby gets your immunity or immune system and your partner's, and then gets the best of both worlds. So what they found was they gave a whole load of different men with different immune systems T-shirts to wear, and they weren't allowed to wear any other smells, so antiperspirants or aftershaves or anything like that. Wear the T-shirt for a while so it gets really sort of saturated with their musk, their smell. And then they put the T-shirts into jars. The men were nowhere to be seen, and female participants had to sniff the jars and rate them according to most appealing or most attractive and less or least appealing, least attractive. And they found overwhelmingly that women found the smell of the men that were most different to them most attractive, and the smell of the men that were most similar to them least attractive, which would imply that there is some level of sniffing that goes along that influences how attractive we find a partner, which you might not even think about. So there's that. The other thing that links into courtship behaviour is, as I say, all of these points that I listed before about colour changes and mating dances and elevated hormones. These are all ways to tell the world that you are ready and capable to reproduce, so that you are more likely to find a partner and reproduce with them. Now, we often refer to it as like being on heat, or it's officially called estrus. And we used to think that females didn't do it. So when they were ovulating, there was no like massive display that said, hey, look at me, I'm ovulating, now is the time, guys. But more and more research is coming out to show that actually it seems like females do. It seems like females become more attractive when they are ovulating. It's just very, very subtle. So there is a piece of research that was done in America, and I cannot remember which university it is, but they looked at exotic dancing establishments and exotic dancers. And what they did was they said to these exotic dancers, can you just give us information on your menstrual cycle so that they knew when they were ovulating or not? And can you also document how much you make each night in tips from your male clients? And what they found once they had all this data is that on the days when the women were most fertile, so around the time of ovulation, that fertile window, these exotic dancers were making significantly more in tips from their male clients, which would suggest that there was something that was making them more attractive on those days. And obviously more attractive sexually on the days when you're fertile is of benefit because it increases the likelihood of you having sex and therefore becoming pregnant and successfully reproducing. So that was really interesting. Again, I'll try and put the link in for that. So in terms of why you need courtship rituals, species recognition. Actually recognize somebody within your own species, because you can't successfully reproduce and have fertile offspring with individuals that aren't in your species. Recognizing somebody that is the opposite gender or the appropriate gender for you to actually successfully reproduce with. Identifying an individual that is capable of reproduction. So they're not a juvenile, they've reached sexual maturity, they are fit and healthy enough to be able to reproduce. Establishing a pair bond. So a pair bond's important after your offspring has been either hatched or birthed, so that you've got two parents in many species that are able to raise that offspring and support each other and keep that offspring alive. But also some organisms are naturally solitary and have a lot of conflict. So if they encounter each other, they will fight, and often one will kill the other. So things like wolf spiders, praying mantis, aggressive individuals. Now, they need to be able to get near each other and reproduce without having a fight. So courtship rituals allow them to signify to each other, I'm approaching you not because I want to fight, I want the opposite. I want to get it on with you. And that allows them to sort of have a truce or a ceasefire so that they can successfully copulate and reproduce. Now, in some situations, once copulation is over, the conflict kicks back up again, and quite often you get the females killing the males straight afterwards. I think we all know about praying mantis and the females eating the guys. Great fun. So that's really important. And then the final one is what we were saying about estrus and being on heat, is actually syncing up your fertility. So not only are they the right gender and they're the right species and they're not going to literally bite your head off, but that they are at the right point in their fertility so that, you know, they are ovulating or the gametes are mature enough so that you can actually be successful when you get together. So those are the main key points when we're talking about instinctive behaviour, biological rhythms, territory, and courtship. If you've got any questions, get in touch, let me know, and I will try and do another video soon to help you out. In the meantime, just take care and stay safe and well. I've just realised that I didn't link in the biological rhythms part, so let me just very quickly say why it is that the biological rhythms impact on territory, courtship behaviour. So if you think about reproduction, a lot of animals need to time reproduction quite tightly. So at the moment we are entering into springtime, and springtime is usually an incredibly favourable time for a lot of animals to be having their offspring, so either giving birth, laying eggs, so on and so forth. That is because if you think about it, springtime, the temperatures are more ambient, they're warmer, they're less hostile, and also the light intensity and the hours of daylight suddenly get far greater. And both of those factors mean there's more photosynthesis, which means you tend to get plants, vegetation growing more. More plants means more food resources. It's a much better environment for you to bring young into. Let's say more food, better temperatures, yada yada. Now, you need to think about, if you are going to have your offspring at that point, when did you need to be copulating? So when did reproduction need to be happening so that you can ensure you have them at the right time? So this is why it's really important for animals to be able to respond to not only their internal endogenous rhythms in terms of fertility, etc., knowing when they are fertile and when they're ready to start a courtship ritual, but also exogenous, so that they know what time of year it is. So it might be that they read temperature changes, it might be that they read light changes, lunar months, etc. Whatever it is, they need to be able to read them so they know it's the right time of year. Now is the time for me to kick off with getting a territory, starting a courtship ritual, etc. So I hope that makes sense. I'm sorry that I left that out. Just got too excited talking about everything else. Thanks.